No bodies were ever found. The ship simply vanished. The only thing that survived was a navigator clutching a logbook and a secret. What really happened during those 2 years of silence? The sound of the Arctic is not silence. It is the groan of tectonic plates grinding against human hope. Valerian Albanov stands on a shifting floe, his boots wrapped in rags that were once trousers. He raises the sextant. The brass instrument is the only clean thing in a world of gray filth and white blindness. His hands are hideous things, covered in soot and sores, fingers blackened by frostbite, shaking as they adjust the vernier scale. He needs the sun to hold still, but the horizon is dancing. He lowers the instrument and pulls a pencil from his fur tunic. He writes on the margins of a water-stained logbook. The math does not lie. He adds the latitude. He subtracts the drift. He checks the numbers again and again. A drop of sweat freezes instantly on his cheek. The calculation is finished. He looks up at the 13 men huddled behind the sledges. They are scarecrows made of bone and mania, harnessed like dogs to heavy wooden boats. They have been marching south for 2 months, fighting for every inch, bleeding for every mile. But the math says they have not moved south. The ocean current has dragged them north, faster than they can walk. They are on a treadmill of ice, moving backwards into the polar night. Albanov closes the book. He looks at the horizon where the open water should be, but sees only the endless, mocking white. He realizes now that they are not explorers. They are ghosts. To understand the nightmare, you must first look at the dream. Before she was a frozen carcass, the Svyataya Anna was a queen of the ocean. She was built for the open water, a creature of oak and steel designed to slice through the Atlantic waves. In the summer of 1912, she left St. Petersburg smelling of fresh varnish and coal smoke. Her brass fittings caught the sun. Her pantry was stocked with French champagne and tins of biscuits. Captain Brusilov stood on the bridge, a man possessing the supreme arrogance of the Edwardian age. He believed, as they all did, that the map was merely a suggestion, and that nature could be negotiated with. They were hunting the Northeast Passage, the legendary shortcut across the top of the world. They saw themselves as conquerors. They did not know they were already prey. The trap did not snap shut with a bang. It closed with a whisper. By October of 1912, the ship entered the Kara Sea. The water here is deceptive. It begins to thicken, turning the texture of oil, then porridge, then stone. The crew watched from the rails as the black water vanished, replaced by a skin of slush that dampened the waves. The steam engine churned. The propeller thrashed against the thickening slurry. But the ocean was becoming solid. Off the coast of the Yamal Peninsula, the world stopped moving. The horizon, once a straight line of possibility, became a jagged wall of white fortifications. The Svyataya Anna was no longer a ship. She was a captive. Then came the silence. The boiler cooled. The fires died down. The heartbeat of the engine room stopped, replaced by the howling wind of the polar night. For the first few weeks, there was hope. They played cards. They organized theatrical plays in the mess hall. Erminia Jdanko, the young nurse who had joined the expedition for adventure, tended to minor cuts and bruises, unaware that she was practicing for a charnel house. They waited for a southerly wind to break the ice and free them. They waited for a week, then a month, then a year. The seasons dissolved into a gray purgatory. The sun abandoned them for months at a time, leaving them in a perpetual twilight where noon looked like midnight. The ship began to change. The condensation from their breath froze on the cabin walls, turning their living quarters into ice caves. The beautiful oak paneling was ripped down and burned for warmth. The library books were smoked as cigarette paper. The ship was not stationary. She was drifting. The entire ice pack, a continent of frozen ocean, was rotating slowly, carrying them north, away from the shipping lanes, away from the known world. They were traveling thousands of miles without taking a single step, locked in a slow-motion abduction. 18 months passed in this white paralysis. 18 months of staring at the same cracks in the ceiling. 18 months of listening to the ice press against the hull. A sound, like a giant grinding its teeth. The discipline of the Navy began to erode. Captain Brusilov retreated into his cabin, a man broken by the weight of his failure. He lay in his bunk, staring at the frost growing on the bolts above his head, turning into a ghost while he was still breathing. The food lost its flavor. The conversation lost its meaning. In the navigator's cabin, Valerian Albanov watched the compass needle swing, plotting a course to nowhere. The optimism of 1912 was dead. The champagne was gone. The dream of glory had rotted away, leaving only the cold, hard fact of their imprisonment. They were not explorers anymore. They were meat, kept in a freezer, waiting to be consumed. By April of 1914, the schooner had become a house of two warring ghosts in the captain's quarters. Georgy Brusilov lay in the dark, surrendered to a strange and lethargic illness. He had accepted the drift. He had made peace with the idea that the ice was now his master. But in the navigator's cabin, Valerian Albanov was possessed by a different kind of madness. He refused to rot. He studied the charts until his eyes burned. He paced the tilted deck like a caged wolf, measuring the distance to the ghostly outline of Franz Josef Land. The tension on the ship was thicker than the frost on the walls. It was the friction between resignation and desperation. The decision, when it finally broke the silence, was not a debate. It was a rupture. Albanov would walk. He would take whoever was willing to follow him into the white void. 13 men stepped forward. 10 chose to stay behind with the captain and the nurse. The preparation for this exodus was a frantic, violent act of creation. They needed boats to cross the open leads of water that scarred the ice pack, but the ship had no boats to spare. So they cannibalized the vessel that had kept them alive. They became scavengers of their own home. On the snow-covered deck, the men worked with frozen hands, sawing planks and stripping canvas. They built 7 kayaks. These were not sturdy crafts of oak and iron. They were fragile skeletons made of ash slats, wrapped in sailcloth and painted with linseed oil to make them watertight. They looked terrifyingly flimsy. A sharp shard of ice could slice them open like a belly. A walrus tusk could shatter them into kindling. Yet these pathetic wooden toys were their only ticket back to the world of the living. The smell of fresh paint mixed with the stale odor of unwashed bodies. A scent of industry in the middle of a graveyard. The morning of departure was devoid of ceremony. The sky was a flat, oppressive gray, merging with the ice so perfectly that there was no horizon. Only an endless envelope of nothingness. The 13 men harnessed themselves to the sledges. They looked less like explorers and more like beasts of burden. They wore improvised harnesses across their chests, dragging the heavy wooden sleds loaded with the kayaks, rifles, and sacks of biscuits. On the deck of the Svyataya Anna, the remaining 10 crew members gathered at the rail. Among them stood Erminia Zdanko. She did not weep. She stood wrapped in her furs, watching the preparations with a calm, statue-like stillness. There were no bands playing. There were no flags waving. There was only the sound of heavy breathing and the creak of leather straps tightening against thin shoulders. Albanov gave the signal. The line of men leaned forward, digging their boots into the crust. The runners of the sledges groaned against the snow, a high-pitched shriek that cut through the quiet. They took the first step, then the second, slowly, painfully. The gap between the ship and the walkers opened. It started as a few yards, then 100. The men on the ice did not look back. To look back was to invite doubt, and doubt was a death sentence. But on the ship, the figures at the rail grew smaller. They turned into dark silhouettes, then into specks, and finally, they dissolved into the grain of the polar twilight. The umbilical cord was cut. The 13 men were now alone on the floating skin of the ocean. Behind them lay the safety of the prison. Ahead of them lay 1,000 miles of hell. The ship, their only home for 2 years, was gone. The first casualty of the march was not a man. It was their connection to humanity. They were no longer sailors. They were intruders in a kingdom that wanted them dead. The human body is a machine, and like any machine, it requires fuel. When the fuel runs out, it begins to consume itself. By the 3rd week of the march, the 13 men were no longer burning carbohydrates or fat. They were burning their own muscles, their own organs, the very fabric of their existence. The Arctic landscape, vast and indifferent, watched them unravel. The cold was a hammer, but the real torture was the internal rot. Scurvy is not a sudden strike. It is a slow, humiliating liquefaction. It begins in the mouth. The gums swell, turning into blue, spongy masses that bleed at the slightest touch. Teeth that once chewed hardtack biscuits now rattled loosely in their sockets, falling out into hands cupped to catch them. The march became a grotesque parade of the dying. Their legs, wrapped in rags and sealskin, began to change color. The blood vessels beneath the skin burst, blooming into massive black and purple bruises that spread from ankle to hip. Every step was an agony, a sensation of walking on shattered glass with feet that felt like blocks of wood. They were hauling hundreds of pounds of supplies, harnessing themselves to the sledges like mules, leaning forward until their faces nearly touched the snow. The leather straps dug into their shoulders, cutting through the layers of filth and fur to grind against the collarbones. They did not speak. To speak was to waste breath. There was only the sound of heavy, fluid-filled lungs wheezing in the freezing air, and the wet slap of boots on melting slush. Hunger ceased to be a sensation and became a presence, a hallucination that walked beside them. Initially, they hunted. When a seal was spotted, the desperation turned them into savages. They did not cook the meat. There was no time, no dry wood, no patience. They ate it raw, their faces smeared with dark, warm blood, tearing at the fibrous muscle while it still steamed in the cold air. They cracked open the bones to suck out the marrow. But the game was scarce. As the weeks dragged on, and the ice floes drifted aimlessly. The seals vanished. The menu devolved. They boiled the violently bitter moss scraped from rocks. When that was gone, they looked at their equipment not as tools, but as sustenance. They took their spare boots, the leather straps of the sledges, even the soles of their footwear. They cut the tough, tanned hide into strips and boiled it in seawater. They chewed on the rubbery, flavorless leather for hours, their jaws aching, trying to trick their stomachs into silence. Then came the knife. One of the sailors, his name lost to the delirium of pain, could no longer walk. The frostbite had claimed his toes, turning them into charcoal black stubs that smelled of sweet decay. The gangrene was climbing his foot, a black tide rising to kill him. Albanov looked at the foot. There was no doctor. There was no ether. There was only a pocket knife and the gray light of the polar day. The operation was crude butchery. 2 men held the sailor down on the ice. Albanov heated the blade over a small flame until it glowed dull red. Then he began to cut. The sound of the knife sawing through dead flesh and the crunch of cartilage echoed in the silence. The sailor screamed until his voice broke, a raw, animal sound that seemed to hang in the damp air long after he passed out from the shock. The severed toes were kicked into a snowdrift. The stump was wrapped in dirty rags. The next morning, the man stood up. He put his weight on the mutilated foot, harnessed himself to the sledge, and began to pull. There was no other choice. To stop pulling was to die. They were a procession of corpses that refused to lie down, dragging their coffins across a white ocean that stretched on forever. The end did not come with a whimper. It came with a roar that tore the sky apart. By July, the coast of Franz Josef Land was visible, a jagged dark line mocking them from across the water. It looked like salvation, but it was a trap. The barometer plunged. The air pressure dropped so low it felt as if the atmosphere itself was collapsing. The wind rose from the north, not as a breeze, but as a solid wall of force moving at 60 miles an hour. The ice pack, which had been their solid ground, began to disintegrate. The secure white fields shattered into a chaotic jigsaw puzzle of grinding floes. Deep black cracks opened up beneath their feet, revealing the abyss of the ocean below. The stability of the world was gone. Panic is a contagion, and it spread through the survivors instantly. They scrambled into the fragile canvas kayaks, pushing off from the dissolving ice edges into the boiling sea. This was the moment the expedition had feared since the beginning. They were pitting wood and cloth against the violence of the Arctic Ocean. The waves were not water. They were liquid ice, heavy and gray, smashing down on the tiny crafts. The kayaks pitched and rolled, their frames groaning under the stress. Water poured over the gunnels, freezing instantly upon contact with clothing, turning the men into heavy, ice-coated statues unable to move their arms. Then came the separation. The storm turned the sea into a maze of whitecaps and flying spray. Visibility dropped to 0. In the chaos, the group was severed. One kayak, carrying 2 sailors, was seized by the current. Albanov watched them drift away. They paddled frantically, their blades flashing in the gloom, fighting to turn the nose of their boat into the wind. But the ocean was stronger. A massive wave rose up, a gray leviathan, and swallowed them. For a second, the white bottom of the kayak was visible, overturned, looking like the belly of a dead fish. Then it was gone. Others were left behind on the ice itself. As the floes broke apart, the gap between the boats and the ice widened. Men stood on the drifting blocks of frozen salt water, their arms outstretched, their mouths open in screams that were instantly ripped away by the gale. They were not drowning. They were being exiled. The wind pushed their ice rafts north, back into the white silence from which they had just escaped. They became small, dark specks against the gray horizon, standing still while the world rushed away from them. They were fading out of existence, erased by the storm. Albanov and the sailor Conrad fought for their lives in the remaining kayak. They bailed water with tin mugs, their hands numb, their movements jerky and mechanical. Every wave that crashed over them threatened to shatter the thin wooden ribs of their boat. They were soaked to the skin, shaking violently, their minds retreating into a primal, reptilian state of survival. They did not think of their lost comrades. They did not think of the past or the future. There was only the next wave, the next stroke of the paddle, the next breath. They were two mites clinging to a splinter in a washing machine of ice and fury. When the storm finally exhausted itself, the ocean was empty. The other kayaks were gone. The men on the ice were gone. The silence returned, heavier than before. There were no more voices. There were no more commands. There was only the sound of water lapping against the hull, and the realization that of the 24 souls who had sailed on the Svyataya Anna, only 2 remained to face the shore. Cape Flora is not a garden. It is a bleak, wind-scoured promontory of basalt and guano, a place where the geography itself feels tired. In July of 1914, 2 creatures crawled onto its rocky shore. To call them men would be an exaggeration. Valerian Albanov and Alexander Conrad were biological wreckage. Their hair was matted into felt by salt and grease. Their skin was blackened, stretched tight over cheekbones that protruded like blades. They moved with the jerky, trembling coordination of marionettes whose strings were tangled. They had walked, crawled, and paddled over 200 miles of moving ice. They had eaten raw meat and drank blood. They had watched their friends die one by one, swallowed by the white silence. Now, they were the only 2 left breathing. They collapsed on the stones, not in triumph, but in a stupor of absolute exhaustion. They were waiting to die on land, which felt like a luxury compared to dying on the ice. Then, the hallucination appeared. It was a shape on the water, angular and dark against the blinding glare of the sun. It had masts. It had a funnel. It was leaking smoke into the pristine air. Albanov squinted through his inflamed eyelids, expecting the image to dissolve like a mirage. But the shape remained. It was the schooner St. Foka, a vessel from the Sadov expedition, anchored there by sheer coincidence. It was a needle in a haystack found by another needle. When the crew of the St. Foka spotted the 2 figures on the shore, they did not recognize them as human beings. They saw 2 wild beasts, 2 specters rising from the grave of the north. A boat was lowered. Oars splashed in the water. As the rescuers approached, Albanov did not smile. He simply held up a bundle wrapped in oilskin. It was the ship's log. It was the proof that he existed. The rescue was the end of the physical torture, but it was the beginning of the haunting. As the warmth of the cabin returned to their bones and the taste of cooked food touched their tongues, the reality of the math set in. 2 survivors, 22 dead. The realization hit Albanov with the force of a physical blow. The Svyataya Anna was gone. Captain Brusilov was gone. Erminia Zdanko, the woman who had nursed them with such quiet dignity, was gone. They had not just died. They had vanished. The Arctic does not give up its dead easily. It encases them. It hides them. In the decades that followed, searches were mounted, but the ice kept its secrets. No plank of the Svyataya Anna was ever found. No lifebuoy washed up on a distant shore. No frozen body was ever discovered sitting in a captain's chair. The ship simply ceased to be. It was as if the white map had opened its mouth and swallowed the vessel whole, erasing it from history. The fate of those who stayed behind became a ghost story, a narrative written in invisible ink on a page of snow. Did they starve slowly in the dark? Did the ship get crushed by the pressure ridges? Did they try to walk out later, only to fall into the black water? The questions have no answers, only the echo of the wind. All that remains of the grand ambition of 1912 is the logbook Albanov carried against his chest. It is a book of dead names and cold coordinates. The letters Erminia Zdanko wrote to her family, carried by the navigator, were eventually delivered, messages from a ghost to a world that had moved on. The story of the Svyataya Anna is not a tragedy of hubris. It is a lesson in scale. It teaches us that the planet is vast and cold and indifferent to our survival. We draw our lines on maps. We name the capes and the bays. We build our ships of oak and steel. But in the end, the ice always wins. The ice is patient. It waits. And when it closes in, it leaves nothing behind but the silence